You may look at the Hollywood stars of yesteryear and think about how oh so refined they all look and how oh so refined they were. Well, I'm here to tell you that that is a result of incredible studio PR. Going on behind the scenes were scandals you still see happening today. All this and more will be discussed today, and this is Talk Hollywood to Me. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Talk Hollywood to Me, where I talk Hollywood to you. I'm your host, Sierra, and this will be the last episode of the semester. Yep, we have Thanksgiving break coming up, quickly followed by finals week and winter break, and boom, we're in 2020, and I'm having a crisis because that means I've lived through 3 different decades. I also turn 21 the Wednesday we get back, so yay. Something fun I learned in the TealTV all-staff meeting was the number of subscribers my little show here has. Unknown to me, there are 119 people subscribed, which is quite baffling to me, and I thought I had considerably less. Knowing that there are that many people subscribed only makes me nervous, but don't worry, I will let you all down at some point. But seriously, 119 people is a lot, and I'm thankful for each and every one of you that listens to me talk about old movies and continuously threaten to kick Thomas Edison's ass in hell. Sappy stuff aside, I promise to bring some fun little old Hollywood scandals to the table, and boy, do I hope you think I delivered. I'm talking affairs, I'm talking about drugs, I'm talking Richard Burton supposedly being a nymphomaniac. There is a lot. There is a great book that's a fun read called Scandals of Classic Hollywood, which covers many, many things, such as how female fans of Latin lover Rudolph Valentino killed themselves after his death, and what is called the longest suicide in Hollywood, which refers to actor Montgomery Clift's personal decline and downfall after a car accident. There's also a fun book called Hollywood Babylon by Kenneth Anger, which, if you're a film major, that name should hopefully sound familiar to you. Many of the stories, I will say, are exaggerated to high hell, and some of the stuff isn't even true, but it's an interesting book. Prepare yourself to see a couple dead bodies and some pictures of boobs. I'm going to lead off with one of the great Hollywood romances that was more or less an open secret, that of Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. Spencer Tracy, at the time of meeting Katharine Hepburn in 1941, was already married with children, as well as Catholic. That is to say, even if the two of them wanted to get married, they couldn't, because the Catholic Church does not look favorably upon divorce, but I'll elaborate on this in a hot second. Katharine Hepburn had been married once before to Ludlow Ogden Smith, whom she met at college when she was 21 and he was 29. At her request, he changed his name to S. Ogden Ludlow because Hepburn considered Kate Smith to be, quote, too plain. They divorced in 1934, and Hepburn, in her autobiography, calls herself a, quote, terrible pig for exploiting his love, as she never fully committed to the marriage and prioritized her career. The fateful meeting between Hepburn and Tracy was in 1941 on set of the film that would be released a year later, Woman of the Year. Though Hepburn said she knew right away that she found him, quote, irresistible, Tracy was hesitant at first because of Hepburn's dirty fingernails and suspected that she was a lesbian. That opinion of her obviously changed, and for the next 26 years were in a relationship. Tracy was determined to hide the relationship from his wife and kept it private. He and Hepburn made sure to not be seen together in public and kept separate residences. Hepburn herself made sure to never interfere with the marriage and did not fight for it. I do call it an open secret in Hollywood because they starred in 9 films together, and, it's pretty rare for people to star in that many movies together when they're leads and not be in some kind of romance, unless you're Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, of course, in which you did 10, but there was no romance, and Astaire said Rita Hayworth was his favorite dance partner, but I digress. Quick fact for you all, Fred Astaire later in his life also skateboarded. As an old man, he was a skateboarder, quite the hysterical image. Tracy was an alcoholic, and due to Hepburn's caring and what can be called mothering of him, he grew incredibly dependent on her. When his health once went into a decline, she took a few years off from acting in order to take care of him. She was also, in fact, with him when he died in 1967 from a heart attack shortly after filming completed for Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Out of respect for his family, Kate Hepburn did not attend his funeral, nor did she openly discuss their relationship until his wife's passing in 1983. Supposedly, Tracy's wife Louise had at some point said something along the lines of, quote, I'll be Mrs. Spencer Tracy until the day I die. Hepburn herself also passed from a heart attack on June 29, 2003, 1 month after her 96th birthday. To this day, their romance is considered one of the most legendary Hollywood love affairs. And now on to a quick trip to Gone with the Wind. While the filming of the 1939 film was a complete and utter shit show in my opinion because of everything going on, there were two different sets of relationships occurring during filming. That is the beginning of the relationship of Laurence Olivier and Vivian Leigh, and Clark Gable's long struggle to get a divorce from his wife to marry Carole Lombard. Leigh and Olivier first met in 1936 or 1937 after he praised her performance in The Mask of Virtue. A friendship soon started after, and shortly after that, an affair. However, Olivier was still married to his wife and fellow actress Jill Esmond. Leigh herself was also married to barrister Herbert Lee Holman, a man who was 13 years older than her. At the time of their marriage in 1931, she was 18. Olivier had said of the affair, quote, "I couldn't help myself with Vivian. No man could. I hated myself for cheating on Jill, but then I had cheated before, but this was something different. This wasn't just out of lust. This was out of love that I really didn't ask for, but was drawn into." This quote, for some reason, is just hysterical to me. His open admission to, well, yeah, I hated myself for cheating, but then again, I'd done it before, so it really doesn't matter. This wasn't out of lust. Okay, Laurence. We love the consistency of Hollywood actors thinking with their dicks. But anyway, moving on. Eventually, they moved in with each other. Because neither spouse would grant them a divorce, they had to stay out of the public eye together, much like Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. In the same year, 1937, Olivier, a trained Shakespearean actor, accepted an invitation to perform Hamlet in the courtyard of Elsinore, where the play takes place. He was able to get Leigh to take over as Ophelia, replacing another actress. Though it was interrupted continuously by rain and had to be moved inside, performing Hamlet there became something of a tradition. Following this, both Olivier and Leigh went home to their respective spouses, informed them of the affair, and told them their marriages were over. It wasn't until 1940, however, that they were both formally divorced and free to marry each other. The marriage lasted for 20 years. By the late 1950s, however, the marriage was deteriorating. Vivian Leigh had, for a long time, been struggling with mental health issues such as depression and bipolar disorder. In 1956, following her last performance in the play South Sea Bubble, Leigh, who was pregnant, had miscarried, sending her into a long period of depression. It said that she had, at a few points, threatened suicide, which was mainly due to her mental illnesses. She'd had a nervous breakdown in the past, and in this time period, mental health really wasn't something openly discussed, so for the most part she had to suffer in silence and keep it all to herself, doing her best to maintain a stoic facade. In 1957, Olivier began an affair with actress Joan Plowright, with whom he'd been starring in a play. Leigh, in 1958, the marriage to be more or less over, started her own affair with actor Jack Merivale. Leigh and Olivier finally divorced in 1960, and Oliver married Plowright soon after. The rest of her life was beset by further illness. In 1944, she was diagnosed as having tuberculosis in her left lung and took a few weeks off to spend time in a hospital to deal with and recover from it. Though it seemed to be gone, it recurred in 1967. She seemed once again to recover after a few weeks of rest, but Merivale, after returning from a performance of a play, stepped out for roughly half an hour before entering the bedroom, finding Leigh now collapsed on the floor instead of in bed. As Leigh was on her way to the bathroom, her lungs filled with liquid and she collapsed and suffocated. She died on July 8, 1967. Once Merivale contacted her family, he was able to get a hold of Olivier, who rushed over immediately, arranged funeral plans with Merivale, and stayed by her side until her body was removed from the apartment. As per her will, Leigh was cremated and her ashes scattered in the lake by her summer home, Tickeridge Mill. For the last 15 years of his life, Olivier's health also deteriorated. He was suffering from thrombosis and, dermatomyositis, a degenerative muscle disorder. He took time off to recover and died some years later on July 11, 1989. One thing to note is that during the filming of Gone with the Wind, Olivier would show up on set to visit Leigh and kept having to be shooed off because if he was seen there with her, the press would go into a frenzy and ruin the movie, so they repeatedly had to tell him to F off. The same can be said for our next couple, Clark Gable and Carole Lombard. Clark Gable, who played the Rhett butler to Leigh's Scarlett O'Hara, was also married at the time but had begun an affair with comedy actress Carole Lombard. They had actually first met on set of an earlier movie, No Man of Her Own, in 1932. Lombard was still married to William Powell at this time, and Gable was married to Maria Langham. The pair really could not stand each other despite playing love interests and were rather indifferent towards each other. Lombard was prone to using colorful language, and by that I mean she, like myself, frequently swore, and Gable was really not sure he approved of that or even liked it. Despite this, Gable had nicknamed her Ma, as in the movie, and Lombard retaliated by calling him Pa. On the last day of filming, he gave her a pair of ballet slippers with a card attached that read, "To a true prima donna." Lombard then gave Gable a ham with his picture on it. The two did not remain in contact, and it was only 4 years later that they became reacquainted at a party, and a romance blossomed. Lombard had by this point been divorced from William Powell and was free to marry Gable. But Gable himself was still married, and his wife didn't want a divorce. Cue the lengthy, expensive divorce proceedings during the filming of the highest-grossing film of all time when adjusted for inflation. Gable and Lombard were still inseparable at this point 3 years later, and tabloids as well as fan magazines had already reported on their relationship, dubbing them an official couple. The divorce proceedings were quite expensive, but it finally went through on March 7, 1939, when Gable's salary from the movie allowed him to pay his wife, and they were married. Shortly thereafter, the two married on March 29th during a break in filming and had a brief weekend honeymoon. The film was finished, and fellow co-star Leslie Howard left Hollywood, disenchanted by it, to go back to his native England to help with the war effort, as the Second World War had already begun in Europe, but we, of course, did not enter the fray until 2 years later, in 1941. Oddly enough, his demise parallels that of Carole Lombard's. Gone with the Wind took place in Atlanta, so it was only natural for the film premiere to be there. However, due to the Jim Crow laws, Hattie McDaniel and Butterfly McQueen could not attend. Gable was on track to protest the premiere of the movie if they couldn't be there, but McDaniel eventually talked him out of it. Joke's on the Southern racists, though, because McDaniel became the first black person to win an Academy Award, which was for Best Supporting Actress. Gable himself was also nominated for an Oscar for Best Actor, but lost to Robert Donat in Goodbye, Mr. Chips, which would later be remade 30 years later with one of my favorite actors, Peter O'Toole. Please, for the love of God, do not get me started on his 8 Oscar nominations and 0 wins, because I will be complaining for years to come, just like I already have. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, many Hollywood actors and actresses joined the war effort, like James Stewart and Gable included, but not until after one incident involving Lombard. Lombard went on a Red Cross tour across the country, as well as bond drives, and went to her home state of Indiana with her mother Bess and Gable's press agent Otto Winkler for a war bond rally where they managed to raise $2 million in a single night. The original plans to return to Los Angeles was by train, but Lombard wanted to fly instead in order to get home more quickly. Her mother, as well as Winkler, were both afraid of flying and wanted to stick to their original plans, but settled on a coin toss to decide the outcome, and Carole won. In the early hours of January 16, 1942, the group boarded their plane, and 15 Army soldiers did as well. After refueling in Las Vegas, the plane crashed into double-up peak of the Potosi Mountains, killing all 22 people on board instantly. Many factors resulted in this crash, including the pilots not knowing how to fly around mountains, as well as little light, as it was 7 in the evening. Gable received the news and had to fly out to identify and claim the bodies of Winkler, Bess, and Lombard. Lombard's funeral was on January 21st. Out of respect for her, there was a line removed from her final film role, 1942's To Be or Not to Be, which would later be remade some 40 years later by Mel Brooks. The line was said by her character. It was, quote, "What can happen on a plane?" And despite remarrying, Clark Gable was forever upset by her death and never truly got over it. Another fun fact from yours truly, something similar happened in the MASH TV series with a line that hinted at something else. In the script of an unproduced episode, supposedly the only script not produced, Hawkeye Pierce, played by Alan Alda, had asked, "What's the worst that can happen with a chicken?" And if you look up a scene that happens in the finale, well, you'll find out exactly what. Coincidentally, Leslie Howard also died in a plane accident 1 year later in 1943, in which the plane he was on was shot down by German forces over the Bay of Biscay, which is between Spain and France. He was flying back to the UK from Portugal. One long-standing theory was that the Germans believed Winston Churchill was on board and shut the plane down for this reason. Churchill himself later expressed sympathy about how a mistake about his activities led to so many people dying. In a documentary about Leslie Howard, there was a moment where his daughter was talking about how Leslie Howard was fully prepared to divorce her mother to marry Merle Oberon, whom he met on set of a movie. There was one moment where the daughter was left with Merle Oberon to hang out while Leslie Howard had gone off to do errands or whatever he was doing. And the daughter really did not like Merle Oberon, but she sucked it up because her dad loved her, and she just really wanted to get along with her. Eventually, Merle Oberon left. Leslie Howard came to pick up his daughter and asked his daughter what she thought about Merle Oberon. She, lying through her teeth, said that she really liked her and that she was, perfectly okay with whatever was going on. And her father said to her, "Really? Because she couldn't stand you." And so the relationship with Merle Oberon ended. But with that other past sad stuff out of the way, let's move on to something a little more fun. Marijuana, reefer, cannabis, pot, weed, the devil's lettuce. God, I absolutely love saying the devil's lettuce because it's just so funny for no reason. People actually said that seriously at one point and probably still do, and I adore it. As reported by the St. Petersburg Times, Robert Mitchum, a primarily film noir actor at this time, was arrested along with two other actresses. He was 31, they were 20 and 25 respectively, in a narcotics bust. The sting operation had been leaked to fellow stars, but Mitchum and Lila Reeds, who was the 20-year-old, were not tipped off and therefore arrested for possession of quote-unquote marijuana cigarettes. It made front-page news across the country, but admittedly, a lot of people weren't too terribly surprised that an actor who was a film noir star was arrested for something like this, considering what noirs frequently covered and dealt with, or at least what they were able to while staying in line with the Hays Code, which is a whole thing in and of itself, especially leading up to and during World War II, but once again, I digress. I already did a ton of research on that last year over summer break where I handwrote 11 pages of information. I spent 5 hours researching. It was up until 6 a.m. doing that so I could prove a friend wrong. I'd later learn my sister did the exact same thing years prior in high school involving the band Green Day, but moving on. Mitchum and Reeds both called the whole thing a setup, which would later be proven to be true 3 years later in 1951, and their convictions overturned. But while he spent 43 days in prison, Mitchum used this, in a way, to his advantage. The tabloids and the press published photos of this noir anti-hero in his prison clothes dutifully sweeping his cell and mopping the floors. Everyone loved this. People went crazy over these photos. Estranged from his wife and kids at the time, Mitchum saying he was a changed and reformed man, and this worked. His wife was convinced, and he was welcomed back into the family. Films that came out after his arrest and release from prison were huge hits. People wanted to see the arrested for pot Robert Mitchum on screen, and he made bank. Though his image went back to perfect, he himself was not, and more scandals and revelations followed him into the 1950s, which there's a lot of stuff with that, but you can look that up on your own time. Mitchum later made a foray into music, which I personally haven't listened to, nor do I really have an interest in listening to it, but again, you can look that up on your own time. Something that I hope to dive into a later episode is the highly tumultuous relationship of Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, who started an affair on set of 1963's epic Cleopatra, which got leaked to the press and had their relationship condemned by the Pope. Oh, for the Pope to be that metal again and denounce celebrity relationships because they were filming in Rome, but he's got bigger fish to fry, like the Catholic Church sex abuse scandals, so fight your local Catholic priest today. Not really, don't do that, that's a joke. Throw hands if you know they're a pedophile, though. These hands are rated E for everyone. Well, everyone, that concludes the last episode of the semester and the last episode of 2019. I'll be back next year for more fun Hollywood stories because there's a lot of drama and gossip to cover and share. What's fun, like I said, I turn 21 the Wednesday we get back, but I'm keeping that night and weekend open for me and my friend to go and get trashed from margaritas at Islands. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on here because I'm not 21 yet. Whatever. The next time you hear from me, I'll be the big 2-1 and disappointing my father by making my first alcohol purchase, Mad Dog 2020. Sorry, Dad. But I hope you all enjoyed today's episode, and hopefully over break I can have a few more scripts prepared in advance for future episodes, so I have a few episodes worth of content done and written ahead of time. Until you all see, or rather hear me again in 2020, have a great Thanksgiving break and a safe winter break wherever you go and whatever you celebrate, and a Happy New Year. If you're interested in listening to any other podcasts, Hawkstream produces some more great content which you can check out at uncwtealtv.org/Hawkstream or on Spotify, iTunes, or in Google Play. Until next year, this has been Sierra with Talk Hollywood to Me, where I talk Hollywood to you. Have a safe break, everyone. Hail to the king, baby.